So, second in this series on exposure, we'll talk about one of the axioms of the three axioms of exposure, which is depth. The other axiom being shutter speed, and the third being sensitivity, or your ASA ISO setting. Depth is what we see within the z-axis of a photograph. For example, if you take a look at my dog here, this is Ginger, and we're up on the Duchesne River. We're fishing up there, and while I was working with my camera, and I saw the shot, and I can see the depth that's going on here, where the foreground, the rocks and stuff, are out of focus, and Ginger is in focus, and then the background goes out of focus. And this was shot with a 135 millimeter lens with a 2.8 aperture on that, and 2.8 is what this was shot at to go through and give that kind of compression. That way, in terms of the background and the midground and the foreground coming together, but giving us that very shallow, this is called shallow depth of field, okay? Later on, her sister Marianne decided to get into the picture here as well. Let me put that off. Now, I'm talking about apertures, and you might not know what that means. It has to do with the opening of your lens, and your fancier cameras, that's really kind of a stupid term, but your more expensive cameras have a built-in blade aperture setup, a blade array that typically is built into the lens itself. And they look something like this. And you're seeing how they can open up into a circle. The more perfect the circle, the better off the lens is, the less aberration we get into in terms of distribution of light onto a film plane. So the smallest aperture there that lets in the least amount of light also allows for the greatest depth of field. Now, I'm saying that deliberately slowly because that's a pretty important concept to understand here in terms of depth of field. And if we were to put numbers on each one of these, those numbers might be just the opposite of what you're thinking here. So let me finish that thought. So if I go down to the lower right-hand side with the most open aperture, okay, that one is letting in the most amount of light. And with that, though, it goes through and gives us the least amount of depth of field. I get confused on this from time to time. So as those go from larger to smaller, we're going from the greatest depth of field on top left to our lowest depth of field, the bottom right. I can get into the physics of this, but that's going to confuse everybody even more so. So let's just talk about the numbers here, what's called a nomenclature, and how these different stops of openings are determined. And again, there's a little bit of a algorithm that goes with that, and I'm not going to get into the science of that either. I'm just going to talk in terms of f-stops. So, for example, on the bottom right there, depending on what kind of a lens this is, let's say it's a pretty fast lens going on. By fast, I mean that its greatest opening lets in a great amount of light, which allows the camera to shoot faster. By definition, we call that a fast lens. And in the nomenclature of lenses, this is probably a 1.4, an f1.4 lens opening. The next one might be a 2.8. Next one might be actually a 4. The bottom middle would be about a 4. The one next to that would be an f8. If you go to the top right-hand side, we're at an f11. At the middle top is an f16, and then the left-hand side on top would be an f22. Now, you might have noticed something. The numbers don't get bigger with the bigger opening. It's just the opposite. Let me show you what those numbers look like on a lens. This is a 58 millimeter 1.4 lens. It's one I use on my Fujichrome XM1. And it's made by Minolta, actually. In fact, this was part of my father's kit, who was a photographer. And I've been able to adapt that to my own camera to use a fast lens that way. So what you're seeing on that silver ring there, 1.4 to 2.8, f4, 5.6, f8, and then it goes f11 and then up to a 22. Those are those numbers that correspond with the diameter of the circle. But again, remember, okay, the 1.4 is the largest opening, and then the f22 would be the smallest opening. Now, what those numbers are really relating to, okay, is not not a diameter, not a measurement of that, but it gets into a measurement of what's called depth of field, and that's what this is all about. So let me show you what we're talking about here. And I can't read the fine print in these, but this is from BHP Photo Video out of New York. They have a nice little series on depth of field, and I stole this from them as they're talking about what depth of field means. So when I'm shooting stop down, like an f/22 or an f/16, depending on the focal length of the camera, that comes into play as well. I won't get into that because it gets even more confusing. I have a greater depth of field. The larger the number, then the thicker that focal plane is. So we have our photographer, and she's shooting to the left. There's three yellow balls there, and the parallel vertical lines you see, okay, give you an idea of what will be in focus along her plane of view, along that z-axis of what she's looking at. And we see that all three of those yellow balls are in focus at, say, an f/22. I'm guessing that's what the little number says down below her, okay? On the bottom one then, she's opened up her lens probably to an f/2.8. And what that does is it narrows then the width of the depth of field. And so if she's pulled focus to the middle ball, that's all we're seeing, okay, in focus. The ball in front and the ball before it are out of focus, just like what you saw with Ginger in the river with the rocks in the foreground and the rocks in the background. Well, that's because she's opened it up to allow more light into the camera. Now, to do that, she's also had to compensate with shutter speed, but we'll talk about that in the shutter speed video. Let's try to explain this one more in a different way and confuse you even more so. Okay, if you could take a look at this graphic here, there are three different planes set up to go through and illustrate what it is that I'm talking about. The first plane deals with the invisible playing cards with the heart and the spade and the clover on there, I think is what we got going on. And they're in they're in that z-axis with the spatial relationship to each other, okay? And there's two channels that going on. The upper channel is that the lens is wide open, okay? And then the lower channel, the one more to the right, is where the lens is stopped down a little bit. So you understand what's going on. Now, if you looked at how those hit the film plane where light is recorded, which are the white rectangles that are there, you can see the one on the left that's totally opened up, that only the heart is in focus, and then the spade and the club are out of focus in front of it and behind it, like the two balls, okay? Or when we stop down the aperture, then we have gone through and increased our depth of field, where then all three of those icons are in focus there. It's tough to understand, I realize, and the more you practice with this, the better off you're going to be. But let me see if I can't illustrate that to you photographically now to have these things kind of make a little better sense. So here we have a shot that's done. This is a 90 millimeter focal length. It's on a full chip camera, full frame, and it's there's a little bit of compression going on here with this at 90. Is it 90 millimeter or is that 40? I think it's a 40 millimeter. No, it's a 50. This is a 50 millimeter. Sorry, 50 millimeter. So kind of a standard lens in that respect. There's a little bit of a telephoto going on, and this is an f/2.0. Okay, so the lens is wide open. The aperture is wide open, letting in as much light as that lens is capable of doing so. Now I'm going to go through and go to an f4, and I'm going to go to a 5.6, and then an f8. Don't watch the numbers, watch the image, okay? All the way to the f/22. Did you see what happened there? Did you see how that depth of field increased? Let me go back. And as I go back, watch what's going on. So we have our background, we have relative clarity, we have our kind of our middle ground, which is the orange boat, that's in more clarity, and then we have the life preserver there. So I'm going to go back to illustrate why I'm showing you this. Now here's where we get photographic with this, okay? Because all that background stuff really isn't maybe very interesting. Maybe what we want in foreground, we want to make that be the topic of our image. That's the story of our image. And we want everything else to just kind of go away. And depth of field gives us that ability photographically to manipulate what's happening within that focal plane in order to get things to just kind of disappear into the background. Okay. Now, again, there's a trade-off to doing this because the more light we have coming into the camera, the faster we have to go through and release the shutter. If we want a lot of depth of field and we go to an f/22, chances are we need to have a tripod to stabilize our camera so we don't get any shutter shake when we release the shutter release, or we don't get any shake just by trying to hold the camera. We'll talk about this when we get into the next video. Okay, so let me go through this one more time. Again, watch the whole image and we'll go through this a little bit more quickly. All right. See a change? So that's where we hone our craft as photographers. When we start understanding what the background, foreground, and middle ground might be doing to tell a story and how we could use depth of field to go through and change that up a little bit. Now, that's all relative as well to focal length. So for example, I'm going to go to a 140 millimeter lens. This is more of a telephoto going on. No, I'm sorry, this is a 200 millimeter lens that we've got going on with this. And its lowest aperture is at an f/4.8, okay? So we're going to do the same thing I did with the other ones here, but because we're compressed now with this telephoto lens going on, it becomes even more dynamic in terms of its depth of field. So 4.8, 5.6, an f/8, an f/11, and an f/16, and an f/22. Did you see that? Let me go backwards so you can tell what's going on here. So the longer the focal length in, the more dramatic we're seeing this depth of field go through and play. That blurriness that you're seeing in the background is called a bokeh. And the bokeh, the quality of the bokeh really depends on the quality of the lens, the type of ground glass you've got going on, and how that can go through and either disappear or how it can maybe sometimes detract within what the image is doing. I don't know if you noticed the bokeh on Ginger. Let me go through this one more time so you can see how that goes. And let me quickly go back to the bokeh on Ginger so you can see. There, right there. So the background on her, if you looked at the texture of this, it's almost circular, and it's circular because I'm using a lens with a lens mount adapter that just goes through and disturbs that bokeh just enough to where it's not all that quality. So I hope you watch this video over and over again. You're not going to get it the first time. And you might not get it the second time. What you need to do is go out and shoot. Okay. In fact, you have an assignment coming up that deals with bracketing. It's going to ask you to do exactly what's done here with this life preserver and the background. And the bracketing goes through and it's compensated with its shutter speed. So the exposure stays the same even though we're messing with the depth of field. And that's one of the main skills out of this first couple of weeks that you need to come away with. Okay? So make sure you pick up the third episode here on exposure.